April 14th, 1945. 6:47 in the morning. A young American lieutenant named David Carver pushed open the door of an abandoned farmhouse and immediately stopped. The smell hit him first. Not gunpowder, not smoke, something worse. He called 2 soldiers over. They walked into the field behind the house, boots soaking in the morning dew, and one of them pointed at the ground. The earth was wrong, too flat, too neat, like someone had pressed it down on purpose. They started digging with their hands. 6 inches down, they hit fabric. American fabric. 20 bodies. All American soldiers. All shot in the back of the head. Their hands had been bound with wire so tight it had cut through to the bone. These men had struggled. They had known exactly what was coming. And someone had done this to them, not in the chaos of battle, not in a moment of panic, but calmly, efficiently, professionally. Like it was just another task to check off a list before breakfast. Within the hour, General George S. Patton arrived at that field, one of the most feared and celebrated commanders in the history of the United States Army. A man who had driven his tanks across North Africa, stormed through Sicily, broken through the Siegfried Line, and relieved Bastogne in the dead of winter when everyone said it was impossible. A man who had looked death in the face so many times he had stopped flinching. He stood at the edge of that mass grave and did not move for a long time. His aide stepped close. "Sir, you don't need to see this." Patton didn't look away. "Yes, I do. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Join us as we uncover more extraordinary stories, forgotten turning points, and the moments that changed history forever. This community is built for people who believe the real story is always more powerful than the headline. Stay with us. What happened next over the following 6 weeks would become one of the most dramatic confrontations between justice and military power in the entire Second World War. Because Patton didn't just mourn those 20 men. He hunted the man responsible. He interrogated him face to face, standing over an open grave. He testified against him in open court. And he made absolutely certain that the SS officer who lined up 20 American prisoners and shot them execution style understood in plain English that no uniform, no rank, and no order from above would save him from what was coming. But to understand why this moment mattered so much, you need to understand the world it happened in. And that world, in the spring of 1945, was a world coming apart at the seams. By April of that year, the Third Reich was dying. Everyone knew it. The Red Army had smashed through eastern Prussia and was closing in on Berlin from the east. British and Canadian forces had crossed the Rhine in the north. And Patton's Third Army, the most aggressive, fastest-moving armored force the Americans had ever fielded, was tearing through southern Germany like a blade through paper. Town after town fell. Bridges were captured before they could be blown. Entire German divisions surrendered by the thousands. But dying empires are the most dangerous kind. A cornered animal fights differently than one in open ground. It fights without rules. It fights without mercy. And in the final weeks of the war in Europe, certain units of the Waffen-SS, the ideologically hardened elite troops of Nazi Germany, began operating in ways that shocked even veteran soldiers who had seen everything this war had to offer. The problem was prisoners. As German forces retreated across a devastated landscape, they sometimes found themselves holding American POWs they had captured in earlier engagements. Men taken during the chaos of the Ardennes offensive. Men grabbed during skirmishes in France during the brutal grinding battles along the German frontier. These prisoners slowed retreating units down. They required guards. They required food. They required management. And in the collapsing structure of the Third Reich's military command, certain officers began reaching a horrifying conclusion on their own: eliminate the problem. 3 words. That is what one SS officer would later say to Patton's face, standing over an open grave. Eliminate the problem. As if 20 American soldiers were a logistical inconvenience to be resolved before the morning march. In the weeks leading up to April 14th, American military intelligence had been receiving scattered reports of atrocities. Prisoners who had disappeared, units that had been captured and never arrived at any POW processing center, witnesses in liberated villages who spoke in hushed voices about things they had seen or heard. But the front was moving so fast, so relentlessly, that there was rarely time to stop and investigate. Patton's orders were to advance. Always advance. Speed was protection. Speed saved lives. Except it hadn't saved 20 of them. The village of Grunfeld, population 400, had been liberated 2 days before Lieutenant Carver found that grave. American forces had rolled through in the afternoon, white flags already hanging from windows, by the time the first jeep reached the main square. The villagers had seemed relieved. The war for them was over. Soldiers had been billeted in homes. A field kitchen had been set up. Everything had seemed, by the chaotic standards of 1945 Germany, almost routine. Nobody had thought to ask what had happened in the field behind the Brenner farm 2 days before the Americans arrived. Nobody except one elderly woman named Herta Muller, who had heard the shots from her kitchen window and had seen through the gap in her curtain the column of men in American uniforms being marched at gunpoint across the field by soldiers in the distinctive black and gray of the Waffen-SS. She had counted the shots. 20. One after another, spaced just far enough apart to make clear that these were not random. These were deliberate. These were executions. She had not come forward immediately. She was 71 years old. She had lived through one world war, and now a second, and she had learned long ago that silence kept you alive when powerful men were near. But when the American lieutenant stood in her doorway, hat in hand, asking quietly if anyone had seen anything unusual in recent days, Herta Muller made a decision. She told him everything. The name she gave them was Hauptsturmführer Klaus Ritter. Ritter was 34 years old. A career SS officer who had risen through the ranks during the organization's rapid expansion in the late 1930s. He was not some uneducated street thug who had been handed a gun and pointed at an enemy. He was educated. Specifically, he had studied at Oxford University for 2 years in the mid-1930s, during a period when the Nazi regime had made deliberate efforts to send promising young Germans to elite foreign institutions, partly for the education, partly for the intelligence value, and partly to build connections with European aristocracy that might prove useful later. He spoke flawless English. He had read Kipling and Churchill and Orwell. He had punted on the Cherwell River on summer afternoons. He had attended formal dinners and argued about European politics with students from a dozen different countries. He understood better than almost any SS officer in Patton's path exactly what he had done, and exactly what the world he had been educated in would call it. He also understood that he was in very serious trouble. After ordering the execution of 20 American prisoners on the morning of April 12th, Ritter had not lingered. He had moved his unit south with the speed of a man who knows exactly what evidence he is leaving behind. Within 24 hours, he had shed most of his unit, changed into civilian clothes over his uniform, and was moving through the German countryside, trying to reach the Austrian border, where he apparently believed the chaos of surrender might swallow him completely. He made it 15 miles. Patton's order issued from the edge of that open grave was simple and absolute. Find him. American military police fanned out across the region. They worked with liberated villagers with captured German soldiers, who suddenly found cooperation to be very much in their interest with local officials, who understood that the war was over, and that their futures depended on how helpful they chose to be in the next few weeks. It took 48 hours. They found Ritter in a barn on a farm outside a village called Schwaben, buried under a pile of straw, with his SS uniform still on underneath a stolen farmer's coat. He had apparently decided that civilian clothes alone were insufficient disguise and had kept the uniform on, which was either a statement of defiance or a failure of judgment that would prove to be the last in a long series. The MPs were professional. They handcuffed him, placed him in a jeep, and drove him back to the field. When Patton arrived at the farmhouse yard, Ritter was already there, hands cuffed behind his back, held by 2 MPs on either side. Patton stood with his back to the prisoner for a long moment, looking out at the disturbed earth of the field. The grave still open, the dark stains where the blood had soaked into German soil. Then he turned slowly. He walked toward Ritter with the measured pace of a man who was in no hurry because he had already decided exactly how this was going to end. He stopped 3 feet away. He looked at the SS officer the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand completely before making a final judgment. Then he asked one question. "Do you speak English?" Ritter lifted his chin. "Yes, I was educated at Oxford." Patton smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has just been handed exactly the tool he needed. "Oxford," Patton said quietly. "Then there's no excuse. A man educated at Oxford understands civilization. He understands what the rules of war exist to protect. He understands the Geneva Convention not as an abstraction, but as a principle that every educated person in the Western world agreed to because they understood what happens when you abandon it." He paused. "And you abandoned it." Ritter's jaw tightened. "War has no rules when you're losing." "Is that what you told yourself?" It wasn't a question. Patton stepped closer. 20 American soldiers. 20 men who surrendered to you. 20 prisoners under your protection under international law. And you marched them into a field and shot them in the back of the head. "They were soldiers," Ritter said. "This is war. Soldiers die in combat." Patton's voice was flat and absolute. "Soldiers die fighting. Those men died on their knees with wire cutting into their wrists. They died after they had already laid down their weapons and trusted that the rules of war would protect them. That's not war. That's murder." Ritter said nothing. "I've seen the bodies," Patton continued. "I stood right here and looked at 20 men who deserved better than what you gave them. I saw the wire. I saw what it did to their wrists. I saw the bullet wounds all in the same location, all from close range, all perfectly placed. You didn't shoot them in confusion or panic. You did it carefully. You did it methodically. You're a professional, Ritter. That makes it worse, not better." "I was following orders," Ritter said. "We were retreating. We had no means to secure prisoners during a forced march. The decision was made out of military necessity." Patton repeated the word slowly, as if tasting something rotten. "Military necessity." He shook his head. "I have been in this army for over 30 years. I have fought in 2 world wars. I have ordered men into situations where the mathematics of survival were brutal and the choices were impossible. And I have never ordered the execution of prisoners because that is not what soldiers do. That is what murderers do." He took one more step forward. "You described 20 human beings as a problem to be eliminated. I want you to understand something about those 20 problems. Private First Class James Morrison was 19 years old. His mother in Ohio lost her husband in the First World War. Her son was everything she had left in this world. And you shot him." Patton's voice didn't rise. It dropped. That was somehow worse. Corporal Daniel Hayes from Texas had a wife and a 2-year-old daughter he had never held in his arms. She was born while he was overseas. He carried her photograph in his breast pocket. It was still there when your men put him in the ground. Ritter looked at the dirt. "No," Patton said. "You're going to look at me." He waited until Ritter raised his eyes. Sergeant Robert Chen from San Francisco. His parents came to America with nothing and built a life with their hands. He was going to be the first person in his family to attend college. He had his acceptance letter in his gear when you killed him. 17 more names behind those 3. 17 more families. 17 more futures that don't exist because you decided they were inconvenient. The defiance in Ritter's face had gone somewhere. In its place was something harder to read. Not remorse exactly. Something more like the first cold recognition of the size of what he had done. Patton told the MPS to take him to the grave. They marched Ritter across the field and stopped him at the edge of the excavation. The bodies had been removed for proper processing and identification, but the earth was still open. 20 rectangular spaces in the dark German soil still damp, still marked by what had soaked into them. Patton made him stand there and look. "You're going to stand trial," Patton said. "You're going to sit in a courtroom, and hear the name of every man you executed, their ranks, their hometowns, their ages. And then you're going to hear your sentence, and I am going to be there personally to make sure that every word of what happened here is on the record for history." Ritter's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "What will happen to me?" Patton leaned close. "You're going to hang, and I am going to make absolutely certain that every SS officer we have in custody understands what happened to you. Because following orders is not a shield. Murdering prisoners is not a military decision. It is a crime. And in this army, crimes have consequences." He stepped back. He looked at Ritter one final time. "Take him away." The trial was set for 6 weeks later, in May of 1945. By then, Germany would be finished. The war in Europe would be over. But Justice Patton had decided did not end with a surrender. Justice continued on its own timeline. And at the center of that trial, standing before a military tribunal, with everything on the record, would be 4-star General George S. Patton, making good on every single word he had spoken over an open grave in a German field on a cold April morning. But in the corridors of American military justice, a question was already being asked that would define not just the fate of one SS officer, but the entire framework of what the Nuremberg trials would later make permanent international law. Could a soldier be held criminally responsible for following the orders of his superior officers? The defense had a strategy, and that strategy was simple, ancient, and surprisingly difficult to defeat. In Part 2, we will step inside that courtroom in Regensburg. We will watch Patton take the stand. We will hear the argument the defense believed was unbeatable, and we will see whether the promise made over an open grave in southern Germany was strong enough to survive the one battlefield Patton had never fought on before the law. 6 weeks earlier, General George S. Patton had stood at the edge of a mass grave in southern Germany and made a promise to 20 dead Americans. He had looked the man responsible in the eye over open earth still dark with blood and told him exactly what was coming. Now it was time to deliver. But between a promise and justice stands the machinery of the law. And in May 1945, that machinery was being tested in ways no one had ever anticipated, because the defense had a strategy, and that strategy was simple, ancient, and surprisingly difficult to defeat. In preliminary hearings across occupied Germany, dozens of SS officers confronted with evidence of atrocities said the same thing with the same calm certainty. They had received orders. They had executed those orders. In any functioning military, executing orders was not a crime. It was the entire foundation of discipline. It was what armies ran on. And if following orders became a crime, then every soldier who had ever pulled a trigger on command was potentially guilty of something. The number being whispered in legal corridors was staggering. Over 4,000 SS officers currently held in American custody across the occupation zones were preparing variants of the same defense. 4,000 men. One argument. And in the spring of 1945, the formal legal framework that would eventually make that argument fail at Nuremberg was still being constructed. It did not yet exist as settled law. And that was the problem Patton was about to walk into. The courtroom was a commandeered German municipal building in the town of Regensburg. The windows were tall and narrow, the light coming in pale and thin. A military tribunal of 5 officers sat behind a long table at the front of the room. Ritter sat at the defense table in a clean uniform that someone had apparently provided him. His hands folded, his expression controlled in the way of a man who has decided that composure is his last remaining weapon. The defense attorney was a colonel named Hargrove. He had spent 20 years in military law. He was not a man who bluffed. He knew exactly what he had, and what he had was a legal argument that had never been cleanly defeated on the record in an American military court. He made his position clear in the first 10 minutes of opening statements. The defendant received a direct order from his commanding officer. Hargrove said, his voice measured and precise. That order was issued within a chain of command that traces directly to the Wehrmacht High Command. Hauptsturmführer Ritter did not invent this policy. He did not volunteer for this assignment. He was a soldier given an order in a time of war under conditions of operational stress that this tribunal has not experienced and cannot fully evaluate from the comfort of a peacetime courtroom. He paused and let that land. If we hold this man criminally responsible for executing a lawful order issued by his superiors, we are establishing a precedent that criminalizes military obedience itself, and that precedent will not stop at Klaus Ritter. The room was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly too long. The prosecution understood the problem. The evidence against Ritter was overwhelming. They had photographs, witness testimony from Herta Muller, physical evidence from the gravesite, and Ritter's own recorded words during his initial interrogation. But evidence of the act was not the same as defeating the legal argument surrounding the act. They needed a witness who could speak not just to what happened, but to why it was murder and not war. A witness whose understanding of military law and the conduct of soldiers was beyond question. They needed Patton. He entered and took the stand without ceremony. He sat straight, his uniform immaculate, his 4 stars catching the pale morning light. He did not look at Ritter. He looked at the tribunal. The prosecutor began with the basics. Date, location, chain of events. Patton confirmed each one with the precision of a man who had committed every detail to permanent memory. Then, the prosecutor moved to the center of the case. General Patton, in your 30 years of military experience, including combat command in 2 world wars, have you ever encountered a situation in which the execution of prisoners of war was justified by military necessity? The room was completely silent. Patton's answer was immediate. No, there is no such situation. Hargrove rose. General, with respect, surely there are battlefield scenarios in which the logistics of prisoner management become untenable. In a rapid retreat with enemy forces closing in with limited personnel and no secure facility available. I've been in rapid retreats, Patton said. I've also conducted rapid advances. In 30 years, I have never once issued an order to execute prisoners because that order is illegal. It violates the Geneva Convention, which Germany signed. It violates the laws of armed conflict that every officer is expected to know before he pins on his rank. And it violates the most basic moral understanding of what a soldier is. He paused. Soldiers fight combatants. They protect prisoners. That distinction is not optional. It is not suspended by inconvenience. Hargrove tried a different angle. General, you have testified that Hauptsturmführer Ritter stated he was acting under orders from superior command. Is it not the responsibility of a soldier to follow orders from his superiors? Patton looked at him steadily. There are orders a soldier follows. And there are orders a soldier refuses because some orders are not orders. They are crimes handed down the chain of command. He turned his gaze for the first time directly to Ritter. Ritter was an educated man. He was not some conscript who didn't know better. He knew the law. He knew the convention. He made a choice. And the choice he made was to murder 20 men who had placed their lives in his hands by surrendering. That's not a soldier. That's an executioner. The defense took 40 minutes. The prosecution took 30. When the tribunal retired to deliberate, most people in that room already understood what the verdict would be. The deliberation lasted less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. War crimes. Murder of prisoners of war. Violation of the Geneva Convention. Death by hanging. The defense filed an immediate appeal. Their argument was the same one that would appear hundreds of times in the following months as the Nuremberg trials expanded, refined, and eventually permanently answered the question of command responsibility. Ritter's lawyers argued that a soldier who refuses a direct order faces court-martial imprisonment, potentially execution. The threat to the individual soldier, they claimed, was sufficient duress to negate criminal responsibility. The appeal tribunal denied it in 11 days. Their reasoning was precise and would later be cited in legal scholarship on the Nuremberg principles. The duress argument required evidence that Ritter had been personally threatened with death or serious harm for refusing the order. No such evidence existed. Furthermore, the tribunal noted even genuine duress did not justify the deliberate murder of 20 individuals. The scale and deliberateness of the act placed it beyond any conceivable legal shelter. Patton's testimony, they noted specifically, had been dispositive. His 30 years of military experience established beyond reasonable doubt that the execution of prisoners was not a standard or accepted practice under any military doctrine, that alternatives existed, and that Ritter's framing of the killings as military necessity was not supported by the facts on the ground. The execution date was set for July 1, 1945. In the weeks between the verdict and the execution, Patton had moved on to the enormous and complicated work of occupation. The war was over. Germany was divided into zones. Millions of displaced persons needed processing feeding housing. Former Nazi officials needed to be identified and removed from positions of authority. The infrastructure of a destroyed nation needed to begin rebuilding. Patton threw himself into it with the same relentless energy he had brought to every campaign. But he had not forgotten Grunfeld. He gave one specific instruction regarding Ritter's execution. He did not want to attend. He had said everything he needed to say in that field, in that courtroom, in that testimony that had lasted over an hour and left no room for doubt. Attending the execution would serve no purpose, but photographs would. Patton ordered that photographs of the execution be taken and distributed to every SS officer currently held in American custody across the occupation zones, not as cruelty, not as spectacle, as education. These men needed to understand with complete clarity that the war being over did not mean accountability was over. That the argument every single one of them was preparing had been tested in open court and had failed. That a 4-star American general had personally testified against one of their number and would personally testify against others if that is what it required. On July 1, 1945, at 6 a.m, Hauptsturmführer Klaus Ritter was hanged at the American detention facility near Munich. He was 34 years old. He had been educated at Oxford. He had once argued about European politics over formal dinners with students from a dozen countries. He had understood in a way many of his colleagues never did exactly what civilization meant and what it required of the people who lived inside it. He had understood it perfectly, and then he had chosen to discard it. Back in Grunfeld, the process of identification had been underway since the bodies were recovered. It was painstaking work. Military identification tags where they existed, dental records, personal effects, letters found in pockets. A photograph of a 2-year-old girl, creased and slightly damp, that still identified one man beyond any doubt. One by one, they got their names back. Private First Class James Morrison. 19. Columbus, Ohio. His mother buried him beside his father, who had died at Belleau Wood in 1918. Corporal Daniel Hayes, 23, Austin, Texas. His wife and daughter attended the service. Years later, that daughter named her son Daniel after the grandfather he would never know. Sergeant Robert Chen. 25. San Francisco, California. His college acceptance letter, which had been in his gear when the SS marched him into that field, was buried with him. 17 others, each one a son, each one mourned, each one returned finally to their names. The Ritter verdict sent a signal that traveled far beyond one execution and one trial. It traveled through every SS detention facility in the American occupation zone. It traveled through the legal teams preparing what would become the Nuremberg trials. And it created a problem, a serious one, because 4,000 officers sitting in custody were now looking at their own situations with new and uncomfortable clarity. The argument they had all been preparing, the argument that had seemed so solid, so legally defensible, so obviously true on its face, had just been demolished in open court by a 4-star general who had spoken for over an hour without once losing his composure or his certainty. Following orders was not enough. The reaction inside the detention facilities was immediate. Defense lawyers began filing emergency motions across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. Legal scholars advising the Allied prosecution teams started receiving frantic communications from their counterparts on the defense side. And in the corridors of the Allied Control Council, military lawyers were suddenly being asked questions that nobody had clean answers to yet. Where exactly was the line? What separated a lawful order from a criminal one? Who was responsible for knowing the difference? And how far up the chain of command did that responsibility travel? These were not simple questions. The Western Allies had spent 4 years fighting a war. They had not spent those years building an international legal framework for prosecuting it afterward. That work was happening now frantically simultaneously with the occupation itself, and the Ritter case had just accelerated the timeline in ways nobody had planned for. In Part 3, we will follow that principle as it travels from a single courtroom in Regensburg into the halls of Nuremberg, where 24 of the most powerful men in the Third Reich are about to sit before an international tribunal. We will see how Patton's words spoken plainly over an open grave became the foundation of a legal argument that changed the laws of war permanently. And we will discover what happened to the one piece of evidence that nobody knew existed until 60 years after the grave was dug. The stakes are about to become much larger than one SS officer and 20 soldiers, and the story is far from over. In Part 1, we stood at the edge of a mass grave in southern Germany and watched Patton make a promise to 20 dead Americans. In Part 2, we watched him keep that promise in a courtroom in Regensburg, where his testimony dismantled the order's defense and sent Klaus Ritter to the gallows. The verdict sent a shockwave through every SS detention facility in the American occupation zone. 4,000 officers preparing the same legal argument suddenly understood that argument had been tested and destroyed. But the story did not end with one verdict and one hanging. Because when the Ritter case closed, something far larger opened. The legal teams preparing the Nuremberg trials were watching. The Allied Control Council was watching. And in Berlin, London, and Washington, the question being asked was no longer whether soldiers could be held responsible for criminal orders. The question was now how far up the chain of command that responsibility traveled. The number at the center of those conversations was staggering. 24 men, the highest-ranking surviving leaders of the Third Reich, men who had commanded not 20 prisoners, but millions of lives, men who had signed not orders, but policies, men who would sit before an international tribunal in November 1945 and raise the same defense that Klaus Ritter had raised in Regensburg. And this time, the whole world would be watching. The Nuremberg trials opened on November 20th, 1945. The courtroom was the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, one of the few large buildings in the city still structurally intact after Allied bombing. The defendants sat in 2 rows in the dock. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, architect of the Holocaust's early stages, once the second most powerful man in Germany, sat in the front row with the composed expression of a man who had decided to make history even in defeat. Beside him sat Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, and 19 others. Combined, these men had commanded armies numbering in the tens of millions. They had overseen the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others. They had started the war that killed an estimated 70 to 85 million human beings. And almost every single one of them said the same thing: I was following orders. The defense teams at Nuremberg were sophisticated in ways that Hargrove's team in Regensburg had not been. They had had months to prepare. They had access to legal scholars from across Europe. And they had identified the central weakness in the prosecution's position, which was that no formal international law had ever explicitly stated that following orders was an insufficient defense. The Geneva Convention addressed the treatment of prisoners. It did not directly address the question of criminal responsibility for obeying unlawful commands. That gap was exactly what the defense intended to exploit. Colonel James Whitfield, who had prosecuted the Ritter case in Regensburg and was now serving as a legal advisor to the American delegation at Nuremberg, understood the problem with surgical clarity. He had brought with him the complete Regensburg transcript, Patton's testimony, and the appeal tribunal's written reasoning. He used them not as the only foundation, but as the clearest available example of the principle the prosecution needed to establish at scale. In a memo distributed to the chief American prosecutor, Justice Robert Jackson, Whitfield wrote that the Ritter case had demonstrated something critical. The orders defense did not fail because following orders was always wrong. It failed because Ritter had a choice, knew he had a choice, and made a decision that no reasonable understanding of military law or basic human morality could justify. The question at Nuremberg was whether the same logic applied to men who had operated at a far higher level of abstraction, men who signed documents rather than pulled triggers, men who set policy rather than dug graves. Jackson's answer came in his opening statement, which remains one of the most consequential pieces of legal oratory in the 20th century. The common sense of mankind demands that law shall not stop with the punishment of petty crimes by little people. Jackson told the tribunal on November 21, 1945. It must also reach men who possess themselves of great power and make deliberate and concerted use of it to set in motion evils which leave no home in the world untouched. The principle that emerged from the months of proceedings that followed was eventually codified as Nuremberg Principle 4. It stated explicitly that following a government or superior's order did not relieve an individual of responsibility under international law, provided a moral choice was in fact possible. Moral choice was in fact possible. That was the hinge on which everything turned. And it was precisely the argument Patton had made standing 3 feet from Klaus Ritter over an open grave and then again from the witness stand in Regensburg. Göring understood what was happening better than most of the defendants. He was intelligent, ruthless, and had spent decades navigating political systems where understanding your opponent's strategy was the difference between survival and destruction. During the proceedings, he attempted to reframe the entire tribunal as victor's justice, an exercise in post-war political power, dressed up in legal language. "You cannot try soldiers for doing what soldiers do," he said during cross-examination. "You can call it murder, you can call it policy, but every nation represented in this courtroom has given orders that resulted in civilian deaths. The only difference between us and you is that you won." The prosecution's response was to return again and again to the principle that Regensburg had established. The question was not whether war produced atrocities. War always produced atrocities. The question was whether the atrocities in question were ordered, systematic, deliberate, and carried out by individuals who had both the knowledge that they were criminal and the practical ability to refuse. On all 4 counts, the evidence against the Nuremberg defendants was overwhelming. 12 of the 24 defendants received death sentences. 7 received prison terms ranging from 10 years to life. 3 were acquitted. The verdicts came down on October 1, 1946, nearly 18 months after Patton had stood at the edge of that field in Grunfeld. Patton did not live to see them. He had died in December 1945, 9 months before the Nuremberg verdicts in a road accident near Mannheim that he should have survived and didn't. He was 60 years old, and the injury to his spine was severe, and 12 days after the collision, he died in a military hospital in Heidelberg, with his wife Beatrice at his side. He was buried at his own request with the soldiers of the Third Army in the military cemetery at Hamm, Luxembourg. The officers who had served under him at Regensburg attended the memorial service the Third Army held in his honor. Among them was the aide who had stood beside him at the edge of the grave and said, "Sir, you don't need to see this," and been told, "Yes, I do." He said later that those 2 words had stayed with him longer than anything else from the entire war. Not as a personal statement, as a philosophy. As the reason a 4-star general had spent his own time and his own considerable authority ensuring that 20 men nobody outside their families had ever heard of received justice. You need to see it, because if you don't see it, you can't answer for it. And if no one answers for it, it will happen again. The 1949 revision of the Geneva Conventions, ratified by 196 nations, incorporated explicit protections for prisoners of war that addressed directly the kind of situation that had occurred in Grunfeld. Article 13 required that prisoners be treated humanely at all times. The revised conventions are still in force today. They did not prevent every subsequent atrocity. No legal framework has ever done that. War crimes continued in Korea, in Vietnam, in Bosnia, in Rwanda. The order's defense continued to be raised. But the framework existed. The argument had been made and won on the record. And every subsequent prosecution, every military tribunal, every international criminal court that grappled with the question of command responsibility was building on a foundation that had been laid in part in a German municipal building in May 1945 by a general who had kept his word to 20 dead soldiers. In 2003, a researcher at the United States Army Military History Institute in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, was cataloging personal papers donated by the family of a retired colonel. Among the papers was a letter handwritten dated June 28, 1945, 3 days before Ritter's execution, written in English, Oxford English, 8 pages long. It was a letter from Klaus Ritter, given to the American chaplain who visited him before his death, with a request that it be forwarded to the families of the men he had killed. The chaplain had kept it uncertain whether delivering it was appropriate, and had included it in his own personal papers without acting on it. It had sat in a box for nearly 60 years. The letter did not ask for forgiveness. Ritter apparently understood himself well enough to know that forgiveness was not something he had any right to request. What it did was name each man, all 20 of them, by the names he had learned during the trial in the order they had been called in the prosecution's presentation. After each name, he wrote one sentence. For Private Morrison, the 19-year-old from Ohio, he wrote, "He asked me before the end whether his family would be told what happened to him. I said yes. I do not know if that was true. I hope it was." For Sergeant Chen, the one with the college acceptance letter, he wrote, "He had the letter in his hand when we marched them out. He was reading it. I made him put it away." The daughter of Corporal Daniel Hayes, who had named her own son Daniel after the grandfather he never met, was in her late 60s when the letter was made available in 2004. She read it. She did not comment publicly. Her son said in a brief interview that his mother had kept the letter, and that she had said it did not change anything, but that it was something. That is what justice leaves you with in the end. Not resolution, not peace. Something. The knowledge that the thing that happened was seen, was named, was answered for as completely as the law and the living could manage. 20 men went into a German field and did not come back out. One general stood at the edge of what remained and refused to look away. One principle was established that outlasted everyone who established it. And one letter written by a man who understood civilization perfectly and chose to abandon it traveled 60 years through a box of forgotten papers to reach the daughter of a man he had killed in a field in 1945. The story of Patton and the 20 men from Grunfeld does not end with a triumph. It does not end with a perfect legal system or a world free from atrocity. It ends with a principle fragile and imperfect and endlessly contested, that some lines cannot be crossed without consequence, that the uniform does not change what the act is, that a soldier who knows better and has a choice bears responsibility for the choice he makes. Patton said it plainly, the way he said everything. There are orders a soldier follows, and there are orders a soldier refuses, because some orders are not orders. They are crimes handed down the chain of command. 20 names, 20 families, one promise kept, and a principle that still echoes in courtrooms and conflict zones and moments of moral choice, wherever someone in authority tells someone beneath them to do something that every human instinct recognizes as wrong. The question Patton answered over that open grave in Germany has never stopped being asked. It is being asked right now somewhere in the world by someone who has just been given an order they know they should not follow. What they do next is the story that never ends. We have followed this story across 4 parts and nearly 80 years of history. We watched Patton stand over 20 bodies in a German field and refuse to look away. We watched him face an Oxford-educated SS officer and speak with the directness of a man who had decided long ago that clarity was more useful than diplomacy. We watched him testify, and we watched the verdict come down, and we watched a principle take root in the soil of post-war Europe that would outlast every person in that courtroom. We watched that principle travel from Regensburg to Nuremberg, and from Nuremberg into the foundational legal architecture of the modern world. But there is one question that nobody thinks to ask until the story is almost over. What happened to the people who carried this forward after Patton was gone? Because George S. Patton died in December 1945. He never saw Nuremberg reach its verdicts. He never saw the Geneva Conventions formally revised and strengthened in 1949. He never saw the world he had fought to defend begin haltingly and imperfectly to build the legal architecture that might prevent the next war from producing the same atrocities as the last one. He died on a German road in peacetime. And the story that outlasted him is the one that matters most. The accident happened on December 9, 1945, near Mannheim. A collision between his staff car and a military truck on a road he had driven dozens of times during the campaign. The impact was not catastrophic by the standards of what Patton had survived in his career. But he was 60 years old, and the injury to his spine was severe, and 12 days later he died in a military hospital in Heidelberg with his wife Beatrice at his side. His last words recorded by those present were characteristically direct. He said he was ready. He was buried at his own request with the soldiers of the Third Army. Not in a general's plot, not in a monument to himself, but with the men he had commanded in the military cemetery at Ham, Luxembourg. He had driven those men across a continent. He wanted to stay with them. The officers who had served under him at Regensburg attended the memorial service the Third Army held in his honor. Among them were the MPs who had brought Ritter back to the farm, the prosecutor who had built the case, and the aide who had stood beside Patton at the edge of the grave and said, "Sir, you don't need to see this," and been told, "Yes, I do." That aide, a lieutenant colonel named Arthur Gaines, said in an interview conducted 30 years later that those two words had stayed with him longer than any order, any battle, any moment from the entire war. Not as a personal statement, as a philosophy. As the reason a four-star general had spent his own time, his own testimony, his own considerable authority, ensuring that 20 men, nobody outside their families had ever heard of, received justice. You need to see it. Because if you don't see it, you can't answer for it. And if no one answers for it, it will happen again. Colonel James Whitfield, who had prosecuted the Ritter case in Regensburg and carried that transcript to Nuremberg, went on to serve in the Judge Advocate General's Corps through the Korean War. He retired in 1961 as a brigadier general. In 1952, he published a legal journal article arguing that the Ritter case had been systematically underestimated in its historical significance precisely because of its scale. 1 officer, 20 victims, 1 rural village. The major Nuremberg defendants had commanded entire armies and entire programs of systematic murder. Ritter was almost minor by comparison, but that smallness, Whitfield argued, was exactly what made the case powerful. It stripped away the complexity. It showed the principle in its simplest and most unavoidable form. A man who knew better made a choice that the law did not permit, and was held accountable for that choice regardless of the orders he had received. If that principle held for Ritter, it held for everyone above him as well. The article was cited in 17 subsequent legal proceedings across 4 decades. Whitfield died in 1978. He kept a photograph on his office wall until the end. Not of Nuremberg, not of the Regensburg courtroom, not of any medal or ceremony. It was a photograph of the field behind the Brenner farm in Grunfeld, taken on the morning of April 14, 1945, before the bodies had been removed. He never explained why he kept it there. He didn't need to. The legal principle that emerged from Regensburg and was codified at Nuremberg did not stay in courtrooms. It traveled. It grew. It was tested and stretched, and sometimes ignored, and sometimes upheld with courage in circumstances far more difficult than a post-war tribunal with the full weight of Allied military authority behind it. The 1949 Geneva Conventions, ratified initially by 63 nations and eventually by all 196 recognized states on Earth, incorporated explicit protections for prisoners of war that addressed directly what had happened in that field. Article 13 mandated humane treatment at all times. Article 99 prohibited coercion. These were not new ideas. They were ideas that had always existed in the moral instincts of soldiers who understood what their profession was supposed to mean. What was new was that they were now enforceable in ways they had never been before. In Korea, American forces prosecuted North Korean and Chinese officers for the summary execution of prisoners, citing Nuremberg precedent directly. In 1968, the My Lai massacre in Vietnam produced a court-martial that turned on precisely the order's defense that Ritter had raised and Patton had demolished in Regensburg 23 years earlier. Lieutenant William Calley's conviction and the enormous controversy it generated demonstrated both the power and the fragility of the principle. The law said individual soldiers bore responsibility for criminal orders. Society struggled, as it always had, with what that meant in practice on the ground, in the chaos, in the moment when the order comes down and the gun is in your hand. In Bosnia in the 1990s, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia prosecuted commanders for atrocities committed by soldiers under their command, extending the principle of command responsibility upward in exactly the way Whitfield had argued in 1952. In Rwanda, the International Criminal Tribunal prosecuted genocide. In 2002, the International Criminal Court was established as a permanent institution with jurisdiction over war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Its founding statute explicitly incorporated Nuremberg Principle 4. The order's defense, it stated, did not relieve an individual of criminal responsibility. From one field in southern Germany to the foundational charter of a permanent international court ratified by 123 nations. The distance between those 2 points is measured not in miles, but in the accumulated weight of every decision made by every person along the way who chose to see what was in front of them and answer for it. The principle itself can be stated simply because Patton stated it simply. There are orders a soldier follows, and there are orders a soldier refuses because some orders are not orders. They are crimes handed down the chain of command. That principle is not uniquely military. It is the same principle that applies in every institution where authority is exercised over people, where orders flow downward and accountability is supposed to flow upward. The soldier who receives the order to execute prisoners, the bureaucrat who processes paperwork that sends innocent people to unjust punishment, the executive who implements policy designed by people who will never see its human consequences. In every case, the same questions apply. Did you know? Did you have a choice? And if the answer to both is yes, the order does not protect you. That is the lesson that cost 20 Americans their lives in a German field, and cost Klaus Ritter his life on a German gallows, and cost George S. Patton 12 days of consciousness in a German hospital before it killed him too in the peacetime that came after. Now for the detail that almost no one knows. In 2003, a researcher at the United States Army Military History Institute in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, was cataloging personal papers donated by the family of a retired chaplain. Among the papers was a letter handwritten dated June 28, 1945, 3 days before Ritter's execution, 8 pages long. Written in the Oxford English that Patton had noted with that cold smile on the morning they first spoke. It was a letter from Klaus Ritter, given to the American chaplain who visited him in the days before his death, with a request that it be forwarded to the families of the men he had killed. The chaplain had kept it uncertain whether delivering it was appropriate, and had eventually included it in his own personal papers without acting on it. It had sat in a box in a Pennsylvania storage facility for nearly 60 years. The letter did not ask for forgiveness. Ritter apparently understood himself well enough to know that forgiveness was not something he had any right to request. What it did was name each man, all 20 of them, by the names he had learned during the trial, in the order the prosecution had called them. After each name, he wrote one sentence. Some sentences were simply acknowledgments. I knew his name. I knew his rank. Some were more. For Private Morrison, the 19-year-old from Ohio, he wrote, "He asked me before the end whether his family would be told what happened to him. I said yes. I do not know if that was true. I hope it was." For Sergeant Chen, the one with the college acceptance letter, he wrote, "He had the letter in his hand when we marched them out. He was reading it. I made him put it away." The researcher consulted with the Army, with historians, and with the families of the victims where they could still be traced. In 2004, the letter was made available to those families who wanted to see it. Some did, some did not. The daughter of Corporal Daniel Hayes, the woman who had named her own son Daniel after the grandfather he would never meet, was in her late 60s by then. She read the letter. She did not comment publicly on what she thought of it. Her son, Daniel Hayes II, said in a brief interview that his mother had kept the letter and that she had said it did not change anything, but that it was something. That is what justice leaves behind. Not resolution, not peace, something. The knowledge that what happened was seen, was named, was answered for as completely as the law and the living could manage. 20 men went into a German field and did not come back out. One general stood at the edge of what remained and refused to look away. One lawyer built a case that held. One principle was established that outlasted everyone who established it. One letter sat in a box for 60 years and then found its way finally to the people who needed it most. From a mass grave in southern Germany to the foundational text of international humanitarian law ratified by every nation on earth. From 20 names almost lost to 20 names recovered, honored, buried properly, mourned fully, and remembered. From a general who said, "Yes, I do," when his aide told him he didn't need to see it, to a permanent international court that exists today, because enough people at enough critical moments made the same choice Patton made in that field. The story answers its own question. Why is it worth telling? Because it proves that even in the wreckage of the worst war in human history, in the mud and blood and moral chaos of total war, a single person's decision to not look away, to not accept the easy answer, to stand in the cold and speak the truth plainly, and then back it up in court, could matter. It could matter enough to change the law. It could matter enough to reach 60 years forward and touch the daughter of a man who died on his knees in a German field in 1945. Some promises kept completely echo longer than the men who made them.